But first tonight, we can expose how the Albanese government is operating in secret and is going to extreme lengths to avoid scrutiny and criticism. The government is forcing stakeholders and industry groups to sign non-disclosure agreements, refusing to allow them to bring mobile phones into policy meetings, and for the first time ever, wouldn't trust their own Labor MPs with details on immigration policy. The Prime Minister promised transparency when campaigning for office, and yet his team has become highly secretive. As you know, the Coalition today voted against Clare O'Neil and Andrew Giles' immigration laws in the Senate, saying they're rushed and hasty.
They couldn't explain how or when they would use this legislation or who it would apply to. We can't support legislation that hasn't had a case articulated.
But tonight I can reveal that Anthony Albanese doesn't even trust his own federal Labor MPs with information about these laws. I'm told that for the first time, Labor MPs were not given an emailed information pack about the immigration policy prior to caucus. Instead, there were physical printed copies sitting on the chairs. There was no time for Labor MPs to read, digest or understand the policy before caucus. No room for questions or disagreement. Backbenchers are annoyed with how they're being treated by the Prime Minister and his Albanistas. One source told me they don't even trust their own Labor MPs. They refused to email out a caucus brief and instead provided paper copies in the room. MPs are not employees of Toyota. Well, if Albanese is so paranoid that he doesn't trust his own MPs, well, look at how he's treating business leaders, forcing them to sign NDAs. Confidentiality agreements have now become very common under Labor for everything from Tony Burke's workplace laws to Chris Bowen's car efficiency proposals, even to religious leaders over the religious freedom legislation. NDAs are usually used to protect sensitive information, and they've rarely, if ever, been used by governments when discussing policy with stakeholders, with the exception of occasional national security matters. Political veteran Dennis Shanahan writes that the government's ubiquitous use of non-disclosure agreements to gag organisations and keep proposed legislation secret is a travesty of Albanese's pre-election promise of transparency and a corruption of the Rudd government's original intent. It's the antithesis of Albanese's pledge from the opposition benches to operate with transparency and accountability if he became PM.
More transparency and accountability. And that's the basis of what we will take forward.
We need transparency here. We need transparency going forward so that we can maximise opportunities, so that people can have confidence in the transparency and the integrity of our political processes.
Well, it's this broken promise on transparency that's most eroding trust in Labor. As The Australian reports this week, Labor's transparency vow lies bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Shadow Attorney General Michaelia Cash had this to say on Peter Credlin today about the government's secrecy.
This government is without a doubt the most secret of governments Australia has ever seen.
Well, Chris Bowen forced car manufacturers to sign NDAs when he discussed with them his plan to effectively put a tax on cars. His laws will make non-electric vehicles thousands of dollars more expensive than they already are, and we know cars cost more in Australia than in other parts of the world because of taxes and the high transportation costs. But Chris Bowen's plan for a car tax was to try and rush the transition to electric vehicles. But why the secrecy? If you have so much confidence in your new vehicle efficiency policy idea, then just let it be discussed openly. Instead, he forced the silence of the car manufacturers. They couldn't speak publicly about a policy that directly affects their commercial interests and the public. And then on religious discrimination laws, well, Anthony Albanese stood outside a church in July 2022 and he promised there'd be wide consultation.
Given that we're outside the church today, what are you going to be doing for them?
That I respect people of faith. We will address the issues of religious discrimination and the need to legislate there. We will do that during the term of Parliament. We'll do it in a way which is much more consultative and brings people together in a way that I hope characterises the way that my government functions.
That's a farce. Much more consultative and brings people together. Yet instead of seeing wide consultation or any consultation, some religious leaders like Archbishop Anthony Fisher haven't been consulted at all, while others have been asked to sign NDAs. Well, what does it say about the Prime Minister that he's broken a commitment he made outside of a church? I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions on that. But if the government can't trust religious leaders to look at legislation, then Labor really has hit rock bottom. Business groups also had to sign non-disclosure agreements just to get a seat at the table when Tony Burke's IR reforms were being developed. And this wasn't even to look at the legislation, it was just for briefings. And then business leaders couldn't discuss the proposals with their own members for their feedback. But the whole idea of an NDA is farcical in any case. I mean, would Chris Bowen really sue the boss of Toyota if he spoke about the laws? Then you've got other ministers like Tanya Plibersek who've forced stakeholders to leave their mobile phones outside of the room before looking at environmental protection policy. The Nightly reports that Plibersek's Nature Positive plan has been shrouded in secrecy, away from public scrutiny, with industry stakeholders only being briefed in Canberra in lock-up-style sessions where laptops and phones are forbidden. And I've separately confirmed that industry groups weren't allowed to take their mobile phones into these budget-style lock-ups, just a pen and paper. I mean, the whole point of consultation is so that stakeholders can examine proposed legislation, discuss it with their members and discuss it in public for feedback. In the Hawke-Keating era, the ethos was to thrash policy ideas out in the daylight and then settle on the best outcome. But the clear intent of the Albanese government using NDAs is to silence stakeholders for political reasons. It's designed to stop negative coverage in the media and prevent the public from having input into policy. Instead, Albanese and his team want to cook up laws in secret and then impose them on the public as a fait accompli. What we're seeing now is a government that promised transparency to win office, but prefers to operate in the shadows with zero interest in accountability.